Hi, so I thought I'd do a video today, and I'm going to do a video about talking about quite a big subject. I'm going to be talking about the unravelling of society um, through the lens of postmodernism and wokeism, and how I believe they have actually got us to a really bad state in society today. And so I'm going to be talking about these concepts. I'm going to be sort of praising them, praising postmodernism as well. I studied as my cat's tail. I wonder what the noise was. He's lying next to me. He's very happy. But he's got a very lively tail. I studied postmodernism 25 years ago at uni. And a lot of people hear the word postmodernism. They don't really know what it means. And they think it's just some farty concept that sort of, hangs around dusty libraries at universities and things like this. And they don't know how it's sort of infiltrated society in the way that it has. Now, I believe it's literally been the downfall of society, along with wokeism. And so in this video, I'm going to attempt to talk a little bit about why. And I'm not going to go into it for too long. I'm going to try and keep it around the sort of 30 to 40 minute mark if I can. So yeah, so it's quite a big topic. I'll be praising it, as I say. I studied postmodernism as part of my degree 25 years ago at a left-wing university in London. And I really enjoyed the degree. I had a lot of fun because it's such a fun concept, or it's such a malleable concept. You can have fun with it, you can play, you can experiment a bit. So when it comes to writing essays, there's quite a lot of leeway there for interpretation. There's quite a lot of leeway, there's quite a lot of play. For all sorts of imaginative approaches, let's say. So that suited me as far as the degree went, and I didn't tend to think too much of it. However, as the years have gone by, I've seen a lot of societal values eroded, and I can definitely see parallels with postmodernism and this undoing of society. And it's deeply unhealthy, and a lot of people might not realise where some of this comes from and a wider picture. They're looking at each individual sort of thread of an unravelling. It could be immigration that seems out of control. It could be gender values that might seem a bit eyebrow raising at times, and so on. But I believe there's a bigger picture that connects all of these points, ties them all in, and seeks to unravel everything that we have built society upon, every value, every virtue, and every solid idea as well. So that's quite a big premise. So we'll see how I do. We'll see how I get on. But this is what I believe. So what then is postmodernism? So postmodernism it follows on from modernism. And modernism was an idea that sort of came up, again, primarily through the arts, but also it came up in sort of other areas in society as well. And modernity it's kind of like a way of looking at things through a slightly different lens in some regards. Finding out that we didn't perhaps know some things weren't quite as solid as we thought, One example of this is psychology. So up until, say, Freudian times, maybe around the sort of 1920s, maybe a bit earlier, to be honest, but I think we're looking at around the sort of 1920s. And when Freud came onto the scene, we'd had quite a sort of basic view of psychology. Freud comes along and talks about the unconscious. Suddenly, there's this great chunk of the brain that we know nothing about, but it's always there and it's always influencing us. So that sort of radically shifted our idea of human identity, and it radically shifted who we thought we were as a species, in a way, you know. And you saw that reflected in some books, in the arts, for example. So thinking of things like Virginia Woolf and Stream of Consciousness, or James Joyce's Ulysses, suddenly we started to see stream of consciousness at play, which is very much a way to sort of detect the unconscious underpinnings of the mind. And with that came other sort of areas as well, where we thought things had been particularly solid, but either through science or just through experimentation in the arts, things started to unravel a little bit. Solidity started to unravel, the notion of it. So, for example, with paintings, we saw things like a surrealist movement. So instead of depicting things as they actually seem to be, suddenly we're depicting things in quite a different way. And the representation has really changed. And so it changes how we think of art and what art is supposed to represent and things like this. And there's other areas as well. So suddenly we get mass manufacturing, say. You think of a Henry Ford car. And suddenly there's mass copies of a thing. So whereas perhaps in the old days, you'd have a particular prototype, you'd sort of put value onto an original, and suddenly originality, the original thing, didn't matter anymore. That meaning was lost because suddenly everything could become copied in such a mass-produced way. And so modernity started then to experiment with the knowns a little bit, with what we thought of as quite solid concepts, and started to play and experiment. And we think of James Joyce's Ulysses as well, because it wasn't just stream of consciousness, but he wrote each chapter in a particular style. And the styles were not the traditional way we would look at a story. It wasn't the traditional beginning, middle, and end. And so we were starting to see perhaps things that we thought of as solid as being a little bit more malleable, maybe. You know, that's a bit of a crude way of looking at it and thinking about it. Postmodernism comes along. Postmodernism is something else. Postmodernism is like humans have got tired with everything that is known. There's a sort of tiredness in postmodernism. It's kind of exhausted every possibility and come up wanting. It's bored. You know, it's experimentation that kind of leads to this sort of ennui, this kind of boredom of life, of everything. So postmodernism comes along and it completely trashes the idea of linear storytelling. Postmodernism trashes an awful lot of ideas that we've held dear. Why does it do this? Postmodernism has decreed that essentialism is effectively dead. Now, we know from science, don't we, that we are a mix of nature and nurture. We're a mix of that which is somehow essentially us, some sort of numinous factor maybe, perhaps something in the DNA but we have our own ineffable qualities. Despite what happens in the world, studies on twins have shown that even in very different upbringings, they still choose remarkably similar paths and partners and jobs and things like this. So we know we're a mix of nature and nurture. We know that some of it is external circumstances that shape us, and yet we still have this ineffable quality, this us-ness that makes us still retain an identity despite whatever happens to us in the world, you know? Well, postmodernism doesn't agree with that, and it tears it all completely asunder. Postmodernism effectively says a human is a tabula rasa, a blank slate upon which anything can be written. Postmodernism says there is no intrinsic sense of self. There is no meaning to be held, either in, say, a text or you, because postmodernism views you, the person, also as text. So postmodernism takes some ideas from modernity and it really goes to town on them. And it does this for more reasons. We start to see what postmodernists term grand narratives collapsing. And a grand narrative is a big story. So you think of things like science, history, maths, the stories that we have told ourselves that construct the world around us. Postmodernism tears them all down. Why does it do this? Well, it's this lens of questioning that it brings to some of these big stories to see if they hold this validity or not. And it necessarily hasn't done that. It's kind of that humans have naturally started to go down this road, and it's lumped together as this sort of movement called postmodernism. And so an example would be history. History, as we think of it, this very solid concept. And yet when you drill down into the notion of history, it's often old white men who have looked at a story in a particular way through their eyes, through their lens, and then they've constructed events as they've seen fit that may or may not have happened in that particular order at all. And obviously, when you think about propaganda in different countries, perhaps post-World War II, for example, and you think about how certain people in different countries may have been told different narratives about the framing of this war, and that's just one example. So growing up in England, we'd have thought of history as this sort of rock solid thing, this sort of impenetrable, unquestionable, body of thought that cannot be changed, cannot be altered. And yet here we are in postmodernism saying, well, actually, what do we really know here? What's absolutely objectively fact? What's objectively true? And so we see echoes of this in literature. In postmodernism, literature starts to play with the concepts of the beginning, middle and end. Literature starts to play with the concepts of time and chop and change, an experiment with form, an experiment with what we think we know as the reader. And that's just one area. There are many other areas too. For example, science, we thought we knew the world. We thought that the world was very solid. But we find that smaller particles than atoms are suddenly at play, and that these particles can also act as waves depending on if you're observing them or not, and behave in a particular way depending on if you're observing them or not. And suddenly this throws everything that we thought we knew about the world into question with regard to very small particles, but also how that might relate and interplay with other areas in life as well. So it's sort of quite exciting, but it's also quite unsettling in a way, because suddenly you, the observer, are sort of responsible for a particular outcome, depending on if you're noticing it or not. When you think of the double slit experiment and things like this. So suddenly participation is kind of really important and potentially might alter the outcome of observable events, which is kind of interesting. So that also shakes the foundations a little bit of what we think we know. And in the arts, there's this sense of a bit of ennui, a bit of everything has been done, you know? I feel now, like looking back, like the 1980s and the 1990s, I feel like they were such creative decades. Truly creative, truly fun, truly zany. And now when we look at films, for example, every tired franchise, every sequel of a sequel and a remake of a remake, everything has been done to death. There are very few original ideas out there anymore. There's a sense within postmodernism that we've run our course, that there are no more new ideas out there. Postmodernism uses particular devices like irony and intertextuality to sort of play with concepts and take a fresh look, as fresh as it can, at the world around us. So intertextuality is the heavy borrowing of other texts, and with a bit of postmodern irony as well. So within films, you'll see an awful lot of a knowing wink with regards to what's going on screen, and very often they'll be referencing another film, and they do so with a great deal of irony as well. And so we start to see all sorts of things start to break down. The fourth wall is often broken in postmodernism as well, within film, for example. So you, the viewer, are sort of talked directly to, etc. Again, playing with concepts of what we traditionally knew. So on the one hand, it's this movement that's observing the natural course of events, which is questioning the world around us and seeking new meaning. And in one of the ways it does this is, as well as sort of collapsing grand narratives, it also seeks to collapse what are known as binary oppositions. So now you're talking about man and woman and things like this. Any sort of pairing of opposites in which there's usually a hierarchy. So man was always thought of as better than woman, for example. And postmodernism seeks to flatten these hierarchies. It wants fairness, it wants justice. Postmodernism too doesn't want to see any sort of persecution of any one group of people. Postmodernism would look to collapse any notions of difference as well. So it seeks a level of homogeneousness. I don't think I can say homogeneity. I managed to say it. Yeah, amongst different races, for example. It seeks to flatten out difference. And one reason it might do this, and perhaps modernity a little bit too, because obviously in the Second World War, what happened then was so horrific that it quite possibly looks at that and goes, well, okay, if we seek to flatten out difference, then there can be no persecution again of any one group of people. So it's sort of got a noble idea, and this feeds into wokeism a little bit as well too, and I'll go into that in a little while as well. So there's this beginning then of this flattening out of concepts. Is man really better than woman? No. There are differences, but what postmodernism will look to do is flatten out that hierarchy completely and completely remove any notion of difference. Gender as well comes into play in this regard. The idea of gender being removed from sex didn't come from science in the first place. It came from the halls of universities. It came from the humanities departments of universities. And one of the people writing about this was Judith Butler in her book Gender Trouble. And I believe there was another chap who came before Judith as well, but I don't know much about him. But Judith certainly put forward this idea that sex and gender are not bound together. So you can have sex organs, say, of being a woman, but you can feel the opposite gender. And here's where things get quite tricky too, because in postmodernism, because of the tearing down of some of these ideas that have held society together, people are now rushing in with opinions. And because we don't have absolutes, postmodernism shies away from any absolutes at all. Because of such things, postmodernism now seeks to place opinions and give them as much primacy as objective fact, if not more so. Because what postmodernism kind of does is it places you at the centre of the universe. So life is what you read into it, because everything is a tabula rasa, remember? Nothing has intrinsic meaning anymore. So this is what we found as well when I was doing my degree 25 years ago. The author intent of a book didn't matter. It was what I read into it that counted. So long as I could prove a particular theory, with a whole bunch of other texts and references and God knows what, that was the intent that mattered, not the author's intent anymore. And that's huge, and that's quite worrying, and that's quite dangerous for society to go down. But it gives rise to various problems immediately. We can see the ideas raised within the sort of gender studies as now being quite problematic within society. And at this point, I need to add a caveat that if you are feeling you're transgender, I have absolutely nothing against any transgender people. I do have a problem with giving children hormone pills. I think there needs to be a great more discussion about this, not necessarily studies done, because children are growing and changing at a terrific rate. Their brains are not formed yet. Their bodies are undergoing so many changes with regards to hormone fluctuations and growth and all sorts of things, that to try to fix an identity, the opposite gender, upon a child before they hit puberty seems anathema to common sense to me. But that's my personal opinion. It's an aside, and I'll park it for the time being. So gender itself then, it poses a particular problem, because now we allow people to identify how they wish to identify. So you can have the sex organs, say, of a woman, and you can say, but I identify as the gender of a man. I identify as being a man. And now there is, this is kind of allowed for, this is kind of accepted. But it also opens Pandora's box, because if you can identify as a man or a woman or what have you, and you have absolutely none of the sort of corresponding body parts, as it were, just feeling, because feeling is now standing shoulder to shoulder with fact, well, then you can identify as a nebula, you can identify as an animal. And so we've got the furry craze as well. And I think it's about 12%, is it 12% of furries, allegedly, who are also transgender. And people who identify with furries, I read a tiny bit of a paper today which reckoned that from one survey done, almost half, so about 46% of participants who identified as furries actually had a problem identifying as a human. They said they didn't fully identify as being human. And that too stems from this postmodern idea that, you know, identity is this malleable concept. It isn't fixed. You can identify how you like, and it puts you again at the centre of the universe because it's how you feel. Biology doesn't matter. Science doesn't matter. If you feel a particular way, that's given great primacy. And that's problematic for all sorts of reasons, not least because feelings change, they're variable, you know. When interviewed, one guy talking about whether or not, one trans guy talking about whether or not he uses, which bathroom to use if he's in a public place. And he said that it really depends on the mood, you know, and I think that can sum it up quite well. Depends on how he's feeling, as to whether or not he's feeling perhaps a bit more male or a bit more female, and so on and so forth. Postmodernism actually goes a step further because postmodernism would say, would strive for gender fluidity completely and nothing to be fixed. So the idea of trying to fix gender as either a man or a woman in society perhaps doesn't quite match with postmodernism there. But this idea of a sort of fluidity, that you can change as well and become the opposite sex, still to me seems to be a subject we haven't fully robustly debated yet. And part of the reason, of course, is it's such a touchy subject. It's such a difficult subject, very emotive, you know. And as I say, I can have every sympathy for somebody who identifies as transgender. So I'm not going to talk about this too much. Suffice it to say, we have sort of changed society in a very radical way at the moment, based on very little science, based more on gender studies at universities. And some people do point to scientific studies and say, look, there is science to back this up. There are parts of the brain that perhaps are more prominent for male corresponding areas or female corresponding areas, depending on how you think you identify, that could be a pretty good marker as to how someone might identify when they're growing up. But even that research doesn't seem yet to be completely fixed in stone. It seems to still be a suggestion, maybe quite a strong suggestion, but perhaps still not quite enough yet to base a whole society upon. So there's that. So we're starting to see what we thought we knew collapsing in some regards and being questioned in others, deeply questioned. The notion of tearing down hierarchies is problematic in all sorts of ways. The problem of difference and trying to iron out difference, lest it lead to perhaps the persecution of a particular group. Now, no one in their right mind wants to see a particular group of people, any group of people, persecuted. Of course they don't. But at the same time, we must acknowledge difference, but we cannot. And wokeism feeds into this as well. And I was watching GB News ages ago, and I don't often watch GB News, but on this occasion I did. And they were just having this debate, few people sitting around a table, and I think it was GB News. And they were talking about the notion of whiteness, because they were talking about the notion of immigration and immigrants coming into our countries in the UK. And they were talking about the notion of whiteness. And one person in their little group said whiteness didn't exist. It wasn't a thing. They refused to acknowledge it because they said, look, when you look at, say, DNA, we're all, I don't know, say 98% similar or something like this. You know, if you look at things on a DNA level and at a statistical level, it points to intense similarities rather than difference. And of course, that feeds beautifully into the postmodern narrative, which would say we're all equal, we're all just the same. And again, it's a sort of tearing down of a particular structure of difference, say. And yet, white is a kind of colour, it is a thing. But this person refused to even acknowledge it. And that comes to the next problem in postmodernism, which is a reframing of reality so completely radically that certain obvious factors get downplayed or ignored completely in order to reframe reality in a palatable way that doesn't hurt feelings. And again, no one wants to see feelings hurt, but to actively seek to ignore truth in the name of not hurting someone's feelings seems mad, doesn't it? Don't we have to acknowledge truth? Don't we have to acknowledge difference to some degree? Don't we have to call out any problems as well in order to tackle them? But in order to do that, we have to see them. And if we can't even see whiteness anymore because we've talked it out of our own vocabulary, we've erased it from what we are able to actually visually see almost, because it becomes such a problematic term, then we start to go down a road that starts to be a bit difficult, a little bit tricky. Problematic is another term you'll hear a lot of in the postmodern community. You're going to hear a lot of, oh, that's a bit problematic. And what they mean is, you can't say that, love. You've got to now find 1,000 words to dance around, to skirt around what it is that you wanted to say. Perhaps nowhere is this more evident at the moment in the UK than the grooming gang inquiry. You know, again, I can't say too much about this, can I? Because it's problematic, because the Cass report, is it the Cass report? No, I'm thinking of gender, I believe. Baroness Casey found, allegedly, that there was a certain group of people committing perhaps a slightly higher number, or maybe even predominantly number of crimes in some cases. I haven't looked into further detail than that. But what a problematic finding in a postmodern world, in a wokeist world, in a world where no one wants to hurt anyone's feelings, right? Because what do you do with that? How do you even frame that? Well, if you're woke and postmodern, you're going to reframe it. You're going to start trying to widen this concept. You're going to say, well, this could be about poverty. It could be about other socioeconomic factors. It could be that this particular area, maybe it was dependent upon a particular area, for example, where there's known to be a lot of poverty and so on. So it starts to examine, to tease out potential nuances, right? So that no one group is looked at in any particular way. And of course, even my talking about this is problematic, because at no point do I think a whole race of people, for example, could be condemned or should be in such a way. Of course not. And yet findings of a report suggest that that needs to be looked into in a really robust way. If you start to tease apart nuance too much, do you lose sight of the original findings? If you start to widen the net and widen the remit, do you lose touch with those original findings? I don't know. I'd imagine you could. And so you'd hope that the study will be sensitive enough that it doesn't seek to witch hunt, it doesn't seek to put down a whole group of people, and yet sensitive enough that it still teases apart the correct nuances and sees the problems and can correctly identify what those are. And it sounds like it started to fall apart at these first hurdles straight away because people didn't want to hurt other people's feelings and so on. And that's just a couple of examples at the moment. So we see there are certain problems at play, and wokeism feeds into this as well. Wokeism, again, sort of comes from this political correctness. It comes from postmodernism. Wokeism seeks, again, it has a noble ideal. Noble ideal because it doesn't want any form of persecution. It wants to re-examine history through a different lens. You'll see people looking at colonialism, for example, and realising how terrible it was and wanting to reframe the story going forward in a different way. So instead of this sort of white-centric view that we've had in England, they want to shift this narrative. They want to shift the focus, perhaps to eradicate again any form of potential superiority whatsoever. Flatten out all hierarchies. And again, that's a beautiful notion. But when you apply that to another thorny subject, I'm covering a few thorny subjects here, but if you apply that notion quite radically, say, to immigration, when we know that some immigrants can be problematic because, and I'm talking about the people coming in the boats at the moment, you know, we know that there are some fantastic, beautiful, wonderful, amazing immigrants here. We know that immigration, it has helped people, it has helped enrich us. It has helped save lives in some cases, people who are being persecuted in their home countries. And there are some tremendously beautiful people here. You know, there really, really are, who are not white, who are not traditionally British and so on. But equally, the people coming off the boats, they're not necessarily the brightest and their best. They're a mix. They're an absolute mix of people. And they're coming off in quite a high number. And every now and again, there might be a news story and so on. And the problem with wokeism, when applied to that and postmodernism, is that, again, it seeks to eradicate all difference. It would say that there is no inherent difference between a person coming off a boat, say, and someone who has, you know, as an extreme example, someone who has, say, had 10 years of university education, say. They would say that essentially these people are the same because essentialism is kind of dead. And so all these people need are the right conditions, the right education, etc., to become the same as. That education is the answer, that the right environment, the right education, all the rest of it is going to kind of fix or eradicate any potential problems because we're all the same. So there are an awful lot of things it seeks to perhaps ignore at this juncture. And so we can see that too being a bit of a problem. Again, we've seen this sort of white Christian approach in England, and that was fine back in the day. Well, I believe that was fine back in the day, but not everyone agrees. And there was a baroness who wrote a little post on X a few days ago. At least I think she was a real baroness. Lovely, elderly white lady who looked back at this video of kids singing some sort of hymn, walking along the hills, you know, very nice bit of old footage. Gosh, I don't know what decade it might have been from, perhaps 1940s, something like that. And she looked at this and she said she could weep. And why could she weep? Well, allegedly because so many white kids. There were so many white kids. It was all white. There were about 10, 20 kids in the picture. And she said, I could weep. We didn't have any other nationalities there. And I thought, wow, isn't that interesting? You know, we grew up in that way. Yes, in a very white-centred world, but then that was our world. That was the world we grew up in. And also it gave us a great deal of security. It gave us a great deal of safety. It gave us a really solid foundation upon which to build a society. Every time we look back in history, we're going to look back through a particular lens. So we're not necessarily going to see the world as it was. We're going to see the world as we have imagined it to be. But when I look at pictures like that, and what do I see? I see the safety, the security. I see a structure that acted in a really sound way to raise the next generation. And what do I see now when I see kids being taken to mosques, you know, white kids routinely going to mosques? Because again, we're decentralizing the idea of Christianity now as well. Everything is flattened out, no hierarchies. So I see more and more perhaps a bit of a nod to other religions. Again, there's a fine line to be trodden here potentially. You know, on the one hand, it's good to be a bit savvy and aware of other religions. On the other hand, as an identity of a nation, you want to have Christianity as your bedrock and your foundation because that's what we grew up with and it's a good religion, you know. But again, all of this restructuring, all of this decentering. So Christianity is now perhaps not seen as such a bedrock anymore. White identity is problematic. Our history is focalised through the lens of some old white blokes and is problematic. And where do we go as a species when we've torn asunder everything that we held dear? And there's just a few examples, you know, there's going to be more. Postmodernism also has echoes of communism, more than echoes of communism in this regard. Communism too seeks to tear down gender difference. And so again, we can see this echoed back in postmodernism too at the moment, you know, the idea that perhaps men could breastfeed or maybe eventually men could give birth and things like this. These attack some very traditional ideas that have been the bedrock for our foundation in this country and in the West for some time. Communism also attacks the notion of beauty. You know, you'll find some pretty ugly buildings in modernism and also in postmodernism. You'll see ugly sculptures, some ugly paintings, some ugly buildings, because beauty no longer matters. There's this sense that intellectualism is given great primacy over anything to do with the heart in this regard. So long as you've got a person who can talk for half an hour about the meaning behind their painting or the sculpture, etc., then that's good enough. It doesn't have to be beautiful anymore. With regards paintings, of course, absolute representation kind of died during modernity. So a painting now, it can be pretty much anything you like. And again, it's more about intellectual thought processes rather than any form of representation of reality. And beauty is not thought of as very important either. Beauty is discarded. Now, there was some documentary on a little while ago. The documentary talked a little bit about beautiful buildings, beautiful architecture, and ugly buildings and architecture, and the sort of concomitant results upon human bodies. And it realised, in this film, it was realised that if people are forced to work in really ugly, dirty, ugly buildings, ugly surroundings, that it has an effect on your mind, on your mental health, but also potentially on your physical health as well. That it's actually quite deleterious to work in these conditions, and that actually a more optimal condition would be to work in beautiful surroundings. In other words, science perhaps telling us the bleeding obvious. And yet, of course, we have so many really ugly buildings, ugly architecture. And as I say, beauty is given scant regard in some elements of sort of postmodernist art as well. Now, I personally subscribe to Keats' notion of beauty and truth as sort of being interwoven and intrinsic, you know. In Ode on a Grecian Urn, he said something like, beauty is truth, truth beauty, that is all on earth and that is all you need to know, or something like that. I've just basically butchered that, but you know what I mean, and you can look up the quote. Basically, he was talking about the idea that beauty and truth are intertwined. That which is beautiful is also truthful, and that which is truthful tends to be that which is beautiful as well in art. That there is this ineffable quality as well. He was also talking about the transcendental. He was talking about something that takes you out of your head, of all this intellectualizing that people tend to do nowadays, and takes you back into your heart, takes you into a notion of the sublime. You know, romantic poets, romanticism very much had a couple of different notions of the sublime. And one of them was simply the notion, which again is found in postmodernism, which is something ineffable, something transcendental. We're talking about God, we're talking about something numinous, we're talking about something beautiful that is outside of your human realm of understanding, and it's certainly outside of your mind, and you'll never find it as long as you're in your mind. You have to go into your heart for a second, switch your mind off, go into your body, go into your heart, and go into stillness, and then you're met by something, you know. And these qualities were important. You know, I love romanticism. I love that period. I love the romantic poets, because they just had this understanding that in beautiful art, beautiful poems, beautiful literature, beautiful paintings, etc., there's just this sense of something. And it's really lovely and it's uplifting, so it's good for you, it's good for your soul. There's a goodness there. There's this inherent thing known as goodness, and goodness is definitely should have primacy above that which is bland, that which is homogenized, that which is not beautiful, that which is really ugly, you know? Again, in this collapsing of grand narratives, in this collapsing of binary oppositions, beauty is given very short shrift in postmodernism, but it's important. And so I feel like we can start to see potential reasons here for some problems that we're facing at the moment in society in quite a big way, because society has become more left-leaning, and it's this left-leaning approach which is now problematic. And as I say, either side isn't great. You know, there's problems. Obviously, the more right-wing you get, there's problems. An extreme left or an extreme right is not desirable. Both sides have serious problems. But the left wing, because they're quite liberal, because they want to be kind and they want to be nice, and again, this ties in with wokeism. Wokeism wants to be nice, it wants to be inclusive. Wokeism will speak about inclusivity. Everything is inclusive in wokeism, except that isn't how the world works. We do not want to upset any particular people or any particular groups of people. Of course we don't. And yet We must be able to speak of difference to some degree, with sensitivity, with kindness, but we must be able to acknowledge these differences and these problems, and we must be able to speak them, because we cannot change what we refuse to look at. We cannot change what we do not see. We cannot change what we have reframed and rewritten to such a degree that now reality and the representation of it through our own eyes and in our own textbooks is now, they're completely at odds with each other. And that is the world, I believe, that we are currently in, this world where we have a representation of the world, and that's the one where it's fine if young kids swap genders, because we want them to feel okay. We want them to feel okay at any odds, and for any and of course we do. We want them to feel looked after and taken care of, but it's problematic when you start giving kids pills. There are a few thousand people every year who detransition, and these people, some of them will be infertile, some of them will bear some sort of artifacts of the transition process. It isn't like a light switch that you switch on and then switch off and boom, you've detransitioned and you're fine, and it was just a terrible mistake, And so, and there are other reasons as well. There are other problems too. Giving hormone pills to kids can, in some cases, lead to problems in the body, such as osteoporosis at a very young age, for example, because you're monkeying around with hormone levels, and hormone levels have so many other functions. As you know, when you're the other side of this, when you're older and you're going through menopause, I'm presently perimenopausal. I am learning exactly what estrogen or estrogen did for my body, which has held it together. It held it together really well. Now I feel like I'm sort of held together by sellotape and a wing and a prayer, but that's all an aside. We're really entering into some very delicate territory with scant research, really. And these will affect people for the rest of their lives. And so we have to know what we're doing. So that's one area where it's a bit problematic. And as I say, I have absolutely nothing against people who believe that they are trans. I take people as I find them. If you're a good person, that's amazing. Whatever colour, whatever creed, whatever you identify as. But we have opened a sort of Pandora's box here. And it's very tricky now to work out what values hold intrinsic meaning anymore in a society keen to tear down all intrinsic meaning. And I think that's kind of where we are. I feel like we stand at a really interesting and quite worrying precipice in some ways, because it's into this world, into this mix, that AI is coming marching in. It's into this world where we have long forgotten the transcendental. I usually finish my videos banging on a bit about spirituality because it's who we are. We're spiritual beings having a human experience. We're eternal spiritual beings. The transcendental is very real. The numinous is very real. None of us really know what on earth it's all about. Not completely. No one does. Some people will profess to have all the answers. No one has all the answers. Apart from God, apart from Jesus, apart from, beings who are on the other side, really. But it's into that mix that AI is coming marching in, and great leaps in technology, and we're about to give away an awful lot of our personal power en masse as well, potentially with digital ID and digital currency. Mission creep will potentially follow, which could mean all sorts of things. Programmable money, governments having far more power than they ever should have, and so on and so forth. So I feel like we're potentially sleepwalking into a bit of a digital prison in some regards. And that sounds a bit, overblown potentially, but I don't think it is. And I think we just need to have eyes wide open in that regard as well. And I feel like we have spent a long time unravelling, the last 20 years easily, since postmodernism really started to kick in and come into play in this regard, to this extent. I feel like we've done an awful lot of unravelling of society. And we're still unravelling. We're now destroying notions of colour. We're now destroying notions of difference in very many areas, perhaps. We're destroying gender identity as mattering, the idea of an intrinsic identity as being something that should be kind of sacred, maybe kind of work towards, as, if you don't feel aligned with it, potentially. But no, it's literally a case of how you're feeling, if you're feeling bad. And as I say, we don't want anyone to feel bad, but we do know that when you're going through adolescence, certainly, that difficult feelings can arise. And ideally, if you feel so inclined, working through those difficulties sort of helps shape you as a human. Coming back to wokeism briefly. So I read online some years ago now, there was an open letter that I read by a group of psychiatrists, and the open letter talked about the sort of gender dysphoria. It talked about trans people, and it said that trans people were part of an already vulnerable group, and that they worried that if they kept a category for trans people, that it would seek to make them a bit more of a target. And they were already vulnerable. And so what they wanted to do, they posited the idea of potentially removing a sort of label from them in order that the society would be more inclusive, right? That they would fit in better in society and be less of a target. And I wanted to touch upon this because, again, this comes back to wokeism and postmodernism and the well-meaning undercurrents underpinning both. But the problematic nature of this is, of course, frameworks are often very important. And if you know anyone suffering any sort of personality disorder, any sort of problem at all, finding out what you've got is golden, because it gives you a framework to work within, and that helps you understand who you are. I think it was Plato who said, know thyself, but that's the first step, is knowing yourself to the greatest degree that you can. You cannot change what you don't look at, you can't change what you don't see, and you can't work with what remains largely unknown either. And I say this as someone who I'm sort of self-diagnosing at the moment as ADHD. I think I probably am, looking at online tests. I don't know if I'll ever manage to get a proper test done via a doctor, etc. I'm not entirely sure I'd qualify, etc., given my age and things like this now on the NHS. I'm just not sure I would. But I think that I do, and finding this category was a relief for some of the things that I'd struggled with over the years and just put down to odd individual quirks. And now I'm like, hey, no, there's a category that I fit into. I'm not the only loony out there. It's brilliant. Not that I'm writing off all ADHD people as loonies, but I do have particular quirks. For example, leaving everything until the last minute. I'm a little bit better now. But at uni, I was especially bad for this. I'd leave everything until the last minute, everything. And then I'd be doing an essay for about 24 hours straight before falling asleep amidst a pile of papers on the bed. But that was how I worked. I needed that adrenaline kick in order to work. Was I producing my best work under such conditions? Probably not. And as I say, I'm a little bit better now with a deadline. But I thought that was a peculiar quirk pertaining just to me. And then to realise, no, it's a thing. It's an ADHD thing. It was a huge relief. So there's that. And I say this because they kind of got their way a little bit in whether or not this was to do with them or something else, but it's similar. So basically, the sort of psychology Bible, the DSM-4, listed the transgender issues as being a disorder. And the DSM-5 talks instead about gender dysphoria. It talks about gender dysphoria, which is the general distress felt at thinking that you are in the wrong body, as it were, you know, rather than talking about this as being a disorder. Again, to remove stigma, again, to be inclusive. These are lovely things. But what are the knock-on effects of this? Well, I would argue one of the knock-on effects of this could be that in making this condition more normalised, then when it's taught in schools, etc., it's taught in much more of a widespread way. Again, to be inclusive, to make people feel included, which is lovely, but then that normalises a disorder. It normalises a mental illness and makes it feel like everyone and anyone could also have this, that this is just something that some kids feel, and widens the net potentially as to who might have these feelings, and allows perhaps greater room for exploration and maybe fantastical leanings, fantastical feelings, with regard to kids thinking, oh, well, maybe I am as well. And maybe some kids get caught in the net who should not be. You know, if kids are rightly identified, if that works fine, then that's great. You know, but if some kids are identified wrongly, if they are caught up in this net in error, then there are other problems at play, not least that these kids, as I say, they can't switch it off. If you've been on hormone pills for some years, you might find that you're now infertile. You're going to find certain physiological changes that have occurred as a result of taking these pills for a number of years that cannot be undone, you know, with the best will in the world. With the best will in the world. So we want to get it right. We want to get it right. If it's going to happen, we want to make sure we're getting it right. So these are just a few of my thoughts and my criticisms at the moment. In seeking inclusivity, we are effectively, potentially capturing other people who might not, who perhaps should not be captured under these categories. One easy example of this perhaps would be women who are autistic, because autistic women traditionally, allegedly, I say traditionally, but allegedly imagine themselves to be trans. And quite a high number of them can get swept up under this umbrella and then subsequently discover a bit further down the line, no, I was trans. It wasn't necessarily gender dysphoria. There's just some discomfort. And that discomfort got swept up and popped into that category. But it wasn't actively that. It wasn't actually that at all. So while inclusivity is a lovely idea, often it can have, well, I say often, I believe it can have potential harmful effects, which the people who cooked up these ideas would never have dreamed of. It was never meant in a nefarious way. It was never meant to harm people in society. And yet now we're dealing with some deeply problematic and thorny issues. And in some areas, we can't name the actual problem, potentially, because we want to be inclusive. So I feel like understanding wokeism and postmodernism, then, to me, is important because it tells us how we got here. You know, we're in a great big mess in some ways. We've undone and unravelled a few things that sort of held society together, or certainly held our country together, held our country's values together. And now you can see this, you know. And unfortunately, what this has caused in some areas is such a divide. Again, we've been so divided in recent years, what with Brexit, Trump, God knows what else. There's been so many divides, but this is another one. So you've got people who've perhaps leaned a little bit further to the right to compensate for what feels like society at large leaning quite far to the left, and never the twain shall meet. We've got these different values. People now grow up very much with this sort of diversity speak, very much impregnated, very much imprinted in their minds. And you've got older generations who simply have no concept where they're coming from, what's going on with this. And I think too that could be exemplified a little bit. Recently, we had Remembrance Day, obviously, not too long ago, and there was a chap interviewed, allegedly. I didn't watch the interview. He's a lovely old veteran, traditional old veteran, and he was in tears and allegedly just said he didn't know why they bothered, sort of thing. Why had they bothered to try to liberate British values? Why had they bothered to try to win the war, and all of this? And I think a lot of older people would understand where he was coming from. And I think not all older people as well. I think quite a few veterans potentially too, because they went and fought for our country to be safe, to be strong. They fought for values. They fought for a sort of honour of it all, and they come home, and then 30, 40, 50 years later, here we are, we're unravelling. We're letting people into our country. We don't know who they are. Some of them, again, are going to be good people. Some of them are not. And some are somewhere in between. But the country feels a lot less safe than it used to be. I think our terrorist level threat, if you were to look at the website, whatever website it is, government-based website, you're going to find that that's probably still elevated above where you'd want it to be, potentially. So these guys are looking at our country and thinking, what's going on? We used to have certain values that we held in very high regard in England. We used to have honour and virtue, and we used to stand for truth, objective truth, and reason and common sense. And people were very forthright about that. People would genuinely back each other up in this regard. So we had a society that was strong and cohesive, Nowadays, very often, say if a shop is getting robbed, the staff will just step aside to stay safe, as will any security guards, because they know the insurance will pay. And so they keep to one side. The police may not even bother to come out, and so on. So there's all sorts of micro ways as well in which the sort of values are just eroded. People just letting things go, letting things slide. And that mounts, it adds up. And we find ourselves here where traditional values seem to have, to use an old-fashioned term, gone for a Burton. They've become eroded. And we find ourselves in this sort of melting pot where people are very keen to rewrite history. People are very keen, hence perhaps why statues got toppled. People are very keen to rewrite reality, to overwrite and imprint their view upon reality, to the point of changing language, to the point of finessing sentences and dwelling in nuance to the nth degree, and being so overthinking about everything and not just coming into their hearts. And so I see a real sense that we've lost our way. We've become a bit entrenched in ideas, in intellectual ideas, in over-analysis, and we've forgotten the very simple ways of connecting with each other, just through our hearts, just coming out of our heads and coming back into our hearts. And all of this too is made worse by online interaction, because online interaction is absolutely much more head-centred, as we type anonymously to someone else who is equally anonymous, and we don't see the expressions. We're not standing with them. We lose that sense of connection, that sense of heart-centered connection that we would have if we were in the same room as someone. You know, connection is so important. What we learned during COVID was that all the Teams calls in the world, all the Zoom calls in the world could never replace actual human physicality, actual contact, being in the same room as somebody, being able to look into someone's eyes, being able to read expressions, body language, all of that. And that naturally makes you emote more, you know? Oh, so yeah, we've just reached this point. We've reached this point where people have sort of swapped a need to emote with a need to be right. You know, there's an awful lot of people trying to win an awful lot of arguments online. And COVID made people hypervigilant. COVID had us all scanning the horizon for threats. And now it seems every day there's a new news story that's horrific. So again, we're very much in our heads, we're very much on hyper alert, and we're not very much in our hearts as well. And so I see this as a sort of great unravelling of society at the moment because of these values. Postmodernism was there at first to sort of talk about what was happening in the world around it, but it's become a sort of feedback loop. That is to say, when people became aware of postmodernism and studied it, and some of these people wrote books and made films which fed into the idea. And so it just feeds back into itself. And now wokeism sort of amplifies some of these ideas within postmodernism. It amplifies a need to be kind to the point of rewriting reality itself in whatever image you see it, which is really dangerous because, as I say, if we can't even speak a truth, we can't see it properly. If we can't see it properly, it won't change. And if things need to change, we're not going to be able to make the appropriate changes because we're not even talking the right language. We're not even seeing it, you know? And when it comes down to objective reality as well, the world that we think we see, we know is not the world as it is. Everything is focalized through us. You know, we see the world through our eyes, but whatever we see, we already have an idea of in some instances. So it's like our brain almost sort of informs what we think the world is going to look like to some degree. And we can only see a certain sort of bandwidth anyway and hear and, you know, there's so much more to the world than we're sort of absolutely aware of anyway. And I just feel like we're losing at the moment. Mankind is losing. We're not winning. We were doing really well before. Did we have an absolute idea of the world around us pre-postmodernism, pre-modernism? No, of course we didn't. And we've learned that certainly some truths have unravelled. Some truths maybe did need looking at and unpacking and working out, you know, well, is this true? Is this not true? Do we need to do this a different way? But what we've done is we've sort of thrown the baby out with the bathwater. We've unravelled everything. And we are refashioning the world through language. That which sounds the most pleasing, that which sounds the least offensive. We are so afraid, we're so afraid of offending somebody that we cannot speak truth. And we must come back to what is true with great love in our hearts, great compassion, absolutely. But if we cannot speak truth about the world, then we do ourselves a disservice. We do other people a disservice. And we do society at large a disservice. You know, we can see where it's heading at the moment. All these well-meaning people who aren't even able to say the word white in some instances, who are terrified of upsetting trans people to the point that we're now allowing a sort of guinea pig study upon children because the Casey report said, well, we don't have enough evidence to suggest that giving hormones to children is a good idea. And so where Streeting has said, well, hey, let's find some evidence. Let's see if we can find some evidence by giving hormone pills to children. Well, these children are effectively guinea pigs. It's going to be a rough study if there are some children amongst this cohort who do not fare so well and who find themselves coming out of this regretfully. Then they are rendered infertile, potentially. And that's inconceivable to me, that we would do that to children, that we wouldn't seek to help a child feel good about the body they're in, even if they feel at odds with regards to their gender. Because the best thing, the most healthy way for a child to grow up is within the body that they're in, within the sort of parameters of the hormones, etc., as they're working through and with this particular kid, you know. Seeking to monkey around with that when we don't really have a clue what we're doing, not really. Seeking to alter these hormones in a very crude way to halt the onset of puberty, etc., is really disruptive to a growing kid. It's really disruptive. And as I say, there can be other health potential problems there as well. And the kids themselves, they won't have a wider grasp of these issues. And as I say, if these things work, well, that's great. But what happens when they don't and a life is effectively ruined? That's a hell of a burden for a young kid. It's a hell of a burden for a young kid to think, well, I can't have a kid, can't have a child now, you know, or that I've got some other health issues that are maybe quite, potentially quite damaging because of this choice. And to lay the burden of choice at our children, to be able to say that they could accurately determine what gender they should be. In some cases, they might get it right again, but what happens when they don't? What happens when it sweeps up people who should never be swept up? And some people too can get caught up in this idea, maybe because it sounds exciting and enticing when you think about the dead naming and you think about the pronouns and you think about this idea of a brand new identity. Well, what awkward 14, 15-year-old perhaps doesn't sometimes fantasize about a brand new identity? And also, again, coming back to this idea of you being at the centre of the universe with regards to postmodernism. Postmodernism sort of panders sometimes to a bit of a narcissistic sense and can amplify a bit of narcissism with this regard, because it says, as I say, no intrinsic meaning in anything around you. So the meaning that you place upon it is everything. And the meaning that you place upon yourself through your identity becomes everything. Identity is the sort of new achievement of our time. You know, people proudly displaying their pronouns. They walk with pride during this sort of, you know, the Pride Month, etc. Become very proud. But it's about who you are or what you believe yourself to be rather than what you've actually achieved in life. These are very, very different things. But we're placing so much pride upon these people because we want people to feel good. We want them to feel included. So wear your pronouns with pride, put them on your profile, do all of these things, and that's lovely. But the ego is fragile and the ego is easily tempted, and the ego can easily find some sort of heady excitement about such value being placed on you because you want to change your identity. Suddenly there's this fuss made of you. Suddenly you're the next big thing. Suddenly you are given a fair bit of attention, and that can be quite nice for some kids, you know. And so again, we just have to be very careful with all of this. It's just such difficult territory. We don't have the answers yet, and we don't even have the vocabulary easily to describe the problem anymore. People are so afraid of upsetting people, aren't they? And of course, there is a level of hysteria around this movement as well. And people are afraid to speak out because of that hysteria too. So that lends a bit of another element in all of this mix, which is a fear of being called out, a fear of saying something which could offend and which could also end a personal career, and so on and so forth. So there's lots of elements with regards to that area alone. But as I say, it bleeds into all sorts of different areas in society now as well. And I feel like the left-leaning lot as well, because they want to be liberal and they want to be kind and they want to be inclusive and all the rest of it, but it sort of does allow for standards to be lower. It does allow for standards to be lower because remember now there's no primacy is placed upon those who have achieved more. This is about equality for everybody rather than equal opportunities for everybody. This is to say that everyone is the same. So there's that as well. So there's problems. There's all sorts of them. And the other thing I just wanted to touch upon was with greater liberation comes a lowering of values, or all of the things that we used to hold dear. They weren't without their problems. You know, we had great morals and great ethics to some degree, but it led to some terrible problems, you know, women being sort of sent off to workhouses if they became pregnant and having to give their babies up, and horror stories like that. So it isn't to say that this was utopia, it was far from it, but there was still this cohesive structure that held society together, and there were some shared values that people worked towards and worked for. And we can see that perhaps the greater the sort of liberal sense in this country, the greater the erosion of some of these morals, some of these virtues, some of these values. And again, we could start to see potentially a sort of moral decay setting in a sort of anything goes society. And we can see that in a number of ways potentially as well. You know, I think we've got some tricky areas to traverse. We've just had, touching upon another area, I'm just touching upon some quite difficult areas at the moment. But one of them is obviously in the summer we had a law passed to now allow for a very delicate subject of voluntary euthanasia with regards to terminally ill people, and that in itself is a thorny subject. Again, it's a potential for mission creep, which we do not want. You know, you look at some other countries where this is happening, and Canada is one of them, and we can see some stories emerging from Canada that you'd never want to have emerge here, and so on. But again, what we are seeing at the moment is the sort of tearing down of certain values, certain things that it seems to be happening in a hurry as well, without real due process, without real proper regard in some instances. And I think we're going to have cause to regret it. Allegedly now too, David Lammy is said to be considering scrapping trial by jury for some minor cases, or relatively minor cases, and just having a judge to pass judgments. And again, that sort of stripping away a very sort of valued part of life in the UK, of having a fair trial, a completely unbiased fair trial as much as possible, and so on. You know, there's all sorts of areas, as I say, where we seem to be sort of throwing caution to the wind and really making some quite radical changes. So postmodernism and wokeism sort of feed back into each other then. They seek to tear down long-held values tear down any notions of essentialism, tear down your identity and what makes you you, intrinsically you, to the point that you can be overwritten, as it were, with a different gender, etc., just based upon how you feel. And I feel like further down the line, that could be further experimented upon with regards to transhumanism, say. You know, because if we're happy chopping and changing our bodies at will, then maybe we'll more readily accept a computer chip. Who knows? So I've started off talking about postmodernism, but really kind of ending on the note of wokeism, because wokeism and inclusivity are the areas that at the moment to me seem to be really deeply problematic. It's all problematic, all of it. But at the moment we need to have the language to describe the world as it is, not as we imagine it to be, not as the fantasy that we can tiptoe around, you know. And people do this, as I say, out of kindness. But in some instances, it could also be almost a form of cowardice, because people are afraid, you know. And I say cowardice, it's very easy to be afraid, to be intimidated by saying a difficult thing, especially if everyone else is saying this thing now and you don't want to go against the grain. So it's almost like a way to make yourself feel better, because you feel like, hey, I've been inclusive today, I've done the thing, you know, which might be why some people talk about it as a form of virtue signalling as well. But then equally, what you've done, maybe, is contribute towards a bit of a whitewash and maybe not looked at the issue in any depth at all. And so that's where we find ourselves, to me. That's where we find ourselves. What comes after postmodernism? I don't know. As I say, I studied this some 20 odd years ago. A lot of people studied it at the time who now work in media, government, social services, the police, all sorts of things, which is now why you see some videos occasionally of maybe a police officer talking to somebody very sternly. Maybe this person has just been assaulted and they've just called the person who assaulted them a terrible name, you know, and the police officer is now talking to this person quite sternly and saying you shouldn't call them this and so on and so forth, rather than actually going, you know what, this is the heat of the moment, this person probably wouldn't use language like this ordinarily, but now perhaps isn't the time after an assault to give them a lecture on what they can say about this person. And I've seen a couple of videos where this has happened as well. So again, it's the wokeism. Again, it's sort of virtue signalling. Again, it's trying to paint the world nicely. It's trying to remove, you know, if someone's just had a very difficult event happen to them, they're not going to describe it through a fluffy lens. They're not going to describe it in a lovely way. The language might be a bit brusque, it might be a bit fruity, it might be a bit much, but it's going to be because they're having an emotional reaction. And if police officers can't even allow for that at the moment, that signals a potential chilling way that this is going, you know, because it's going down the sort of thought police way where you can't say certain things, you can't speak of certain things, because to do so goes against what we are taught we must say, and we are allowed to say this is good, this is not good, you are not allowed to say this. And that goes into a sort of very Orwellian world indeed, where it isn't just about being nice and kind and inclusive anymore, but now it's about punishing you if you step outside the lines. And yet we're human, we're complex, you know. Sometimes we get it right, sometimes we don't. We don't think good thoughts all the time. We don't have virtuous thoughts at all times. When you're sitting in traffic and someone's just cut you up, for example, you're not going to be thinking, oh, a lovely person. It's not going to be going through your mind. And we need to allow a little bit of room for this. We're seeking to try to eradicate that as well. We're seeking to try to eradicate the sort of darkness within the human soul, the darkness within the psyche. But the darkness is there nonetheless. This brings me to Jung. Carl Jung is the psychoanalyst who is the predecessor. He's the guy who follows on from Freud. He studied under Freud for a while. He was his protege, and then he broke away, as often happens, And Jung noted that in the psyche, there is the shadow side of the psyche. The shadow side is the repository for all of the darkness within us. And it's unconscious again. It forms part of the unconsciousness of a person, but it's there and it's in all of us. And so we need to have some awareness of this psychology. When we seek to condemn another, we're effectively also condemning ourselves in some regards, because we too have this darkness within us. We too have this, after the Second World War, following the terrible happenings of that, it was perhaps all too easy for some people to see the problem as, it's, the Germans caused that problem during the Second World War, for example. I use this example a lot because, it's a good example. But what we would know now, if they didn't know it then, is that darkness exists in every human mind. And it doesn't necessarily mean we're all capable of committing a terrible act. It doesn't necessarily mean we all have the same capabilities at all. But it does mean that there is a measure of darkness within everyone. And if you try to eradicate all of that, you're essentially repressing and whitewashing the darkness that exists. And I'm not suggesting that we allow demons to run amok, that we allow people to say whatever it is that's on their mind if it's dark and behave in all manner of terrible ways at all. I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is we must allow for humans to be flawed and imperfect. And we must be able to understand that there are certain circumstances, certain instances when people are perhaps going to speak of things in ways that are not particularly finessed, and that's okay in that moment, potentially, potentially in that moment, it can be understandable, rather than seeking to give a lecture and no, you must never say this kind of thing. As I say, I feel like we stand at a precipice in many different ways. One of them is AI and the greater technology on this planet. One of them is a continuing sort of divorce from knowing our own spiritual nature. And I feel like that plays into all of this. I feel like if we allow this to keep going the way it's going, that it's going to continue to be a bit of a distortion, and that distortion is going to get bigger. And the world repainted in such a way is a fantastic distortion of reality and what's real, what matters, and what's truth, And we need to come back to that. That's kind of the bottom line of all of this. We've lost our way. Humanity has really lost its way, We can see that in so many ways, in so much of this chaos. And I believe that postmodernism played a hell of a role. I believe that wokeism is playing a hell of a role unwittingly. These are good people who would consider themselves woke. Good, virtuous people who have themselves perhaps been led down a bit of a dark path because they don't see the dark underbelly of what they're advocating for. But there is one. There is one. And it just reminds me, actually, before I go, because I have talked an awful lot about this, but I think it was Immanuel Kant who talked about when reason can lead to unreason. Again, he was talking about the Second World War. He was talking about the idea of how can reasonable humans, logical humans kind of thing. How can reason turn to unreason to such a degree? How can it be allowed to such a degree? And I think looking at a bit more of a modern example, we could do worse than look at COVID, because again, during COVID, we saw people acting in quite hysterical ways. I say hysterical, I don't mean funny, hysterical, I mean, there was a measure of hysteria. And we saw people twist reason and logic in quite crazy ways on both sides of the whole thing, And part of the answer could be, well, we're not as reasonable and rational as we would like to think we are as a species. We're just not. We think we are. You can be in your head an awful lot and go, well, no, that's not true. I'm always thinking, I'm always logical, I'm always in my rational, logical mind. But your mind itself, the mechanism by which you measure the world around you, is itself faulty. And you have to know about those faults before you can actively seek to talk about the world around you with any degree of authority. And I'm talking about things like cognitive dissonance. I'm talking about the various cognitive biases that exist. All sorts of things that are out there, that are in here, by which we think we're being logical, but we're not, And you look at the obvious examples, things like the Milgram experiment or the Stanford prison experiment, as examples of how humans can fall in line, even when they should not. How easily humans can be told what to do, how easily humans can employ cognitive dissonance to sort of justify something really horrific happening in some regards. We are frighteningly less logical as a species, less rational as a species than we would ever like to think. And this isn't all bad news, this video. Know thyself. Perhaps it boils down to that again. The more you shed light on yourself through psychology, through knowing the basics of the mechanisms through which you work, through Jung, Freud if you want to. Personally, I'm a fan of Jung. Through spirituality, because when you meditate, again, self-awareness is key. You learn an awful lot about yourself and about the world just through meditation alone. Self-inquiry, self-analysis, a little bit of humility, the ability to have a learning mind and a learner's mind as well, I would say, because very often people, especially people who are feeling a little bit fragile or who are lacking in self-confidence, they might find that they're trying to control the world around them a little too much, and that's perhaps because they're a little bit too afraid to let go. Their ego needs the ego identity of being in control in that moment, potentially, and they can be a bit prideful and a little bit feeling a bit superior to others, let's just say. And if you find yourself in that mindset, I'd be willing to bet that the primary reason why is your ego wants to hang on to the identity that you're right, that you are in this position of primacy above other people. Your ego needs that. And if your ego needs that, that tells me that you are probably not as confident as you would like to be. But it does you a disservice, because if you approach the world through those eyes, through that lens, you don't have a beginner's mind. You don't have the ability to take on board new information because you think you have all the answers already, and so on. There are many, many parameters whereby you just test them a little bit and they fall over in the human mind. There are many parameters that we think are solid, but actually they are frighteningly irrational in the human mind. We are not quite the rational creatures that we thought we were. So we need to know ourselves. We need to understand human psychology a great deal more. We need to understand the parameters of the world in which we're operating at the moment. We need to have a smattering of an idea of wokeism and postmodernism and what people are doing. Because when you, again, it's about a framework. When you can see what people are doing and why, it really helps illuminate what is going on. Why are people framing things in this particular way? Oh, now you get it, right? Now you can go, okay, now I get it. Now I understand. And it helps. But as a species, where do we go from here? You know, we have to come back to what is true, what is objectively true. We have to come back to a sense of beauty in the arts, because that's uplifting and it's joyful, and that helps you as an individual get out of this insufferable overthinking, get out of this sense of superiority, get out of all the intellectualizing that modern life has you do, and come back into your heart. So there's that as well. Just a bit of kindness, but not kindness to mean that you repaint the world around you with language that completely eradicates the truth, but the sort of kindness that allows the truth to emerge with kindness, with decency, with a bit of honour, with a bit of tact, but allows the truth to emerge nonetheless. And that's got to be what we employ as we go forward. If we stand a chance, you know, if we have a prayer of going forward in an honest, truthful way and rebuilding some of what's lost, rebuilding some of what's fallen over, we've got to start from the ground up, because we've sort of eradicated so much that we thought we knew. We've got to start from the ground up and work with what is true, not just what do you want to see as virtuous, what do you want to fantasize about, what do you want to imagine in this scenario. We have to say, well, what is true in this scenario? And how can we deal with that kindly, but ensure that we deal with it, you know? So yeah, so these are just my thoughts for today. And the video has gone on for 1 hour 40. So I said about 40 minutes, but, you know, plus another hour. So these are just my thoughts at the moment. I feel like we've just got a way to go. We've just got a way to go. We've become lost. And part of the reason we've become lost, as I say, is because we've over-intellectualised everything. Every one of us has an internal compass, and that's your conscience. Your sense of conscience will never see you wrong. It never will. We've each and every one of us got one. And we've been taught, perhaps of late, to override that with the over-intellectualising of certain concepts with the left hemisphere of the brain, which is where your logical, rational mind, such as it is, lives, you know. And what we've got to do now is, come back to reality somehow. But we can start with coming back to our conscience. What feels right? What feels off? And that's about conscience. It's also about gut feeling and intuition. Feeling plays a hell of a role here. Feeling into it. Does this feel right? And then looking at the situation, but with all of your senses, not just your brain, because the brain can be used to, as I say, to change reality, but it can be used to, for good or for ill. And if you're not in your feelings, if you're not in your conscience or in your gut feeling or in your heart, you might not know what's right and what's wrong, you know. And a really obvious way of looking at this could be animal experimentation, for example, with regards to, say, the beauty industry. We know that that doesn't need to happen anymore, even with regards to medicine, in a lot of respects, because animals are so physiologically different from humans. The idea that a test necessarily translates from animal to human is not necessarily true, not at all. And yet the tests still run. Why? Because people want the funding. The departments need the funding. So if they say, no, we won't do this test this year, then they lose the funding. So they still do them. It's a tick box exercise. But when you see the animals in laboratories, you feel it in your heart, you feel it in your stomach, you feel sick. You have a visceral reaction to it. And that's good. The reaction is good. The reaction tells you this is wrong. We need to find another way. This is wrong. This is a life. This is a life no less important than a human life. It's still imbued with consciousness, still imbued with sentience. It's still imbued with feeling the same feelings you have. So how can we justify this? That's you. That's your moral compass right there telling you a thing is wrong. Listen to that feeling. That will be your guide in life. We must listen to our feelings. We must listen to our conscience. It will be our guide. It really will be our guide back home. And I say home, what I mean is some measure of goodness on this planet to start rising up again as a contagion, as a wonderful contagion, you know? And there's all sorts of ways, as I say, that we start. And I think going back to your conscience is a bloody good beginning. So yeah, that's me. I've talked far longer than is healthy for any individual. So if you've made it to the end and you want to leave a comment, please do. Please let me know. I'm not just, shrieking into the void, which we usually are, aren't we, when we make a video. But yes, nonetheless, these are just my thoughts for today. I hope I haven't offended anybody, because it wasn't my intention to. And please do let me have your thoughts. Have you studied postmodernism? What do you think of it? Are you particularly woke? Would you describe yourself as such? Please let me have your thoughts on that as well. These are just my thoughts. They are not necessarily fixed in stone. However, I do feel like society is going on a downhill at the moment, and I feel like we just need to start finding ways to find ourselves again, to speak truth with kindness, and to find our own sense of conscience again as a general sort of compass. I feel like our collective compass now is a little bit like as if we were in the Bermuda Triangle and the compass is just spinning, and we haven't got a sodding clue from whence we came, let alone where the hell we're going, because we just rewrote reality, we just rewrote history, and we've pushed all our statues into the water, and we've banned a bunch of books and videos, and we're not allowed to say certain words, and we're not allowed to say certain phrases, and we're not allowed to speak what is true. So where do we go from here? The compass within you. That's where we start. We start with that. We start with our spirituality as well. Meditation, God, Jesus, whatever you have to do to come back into your senses, to get out of this a little bit, the chatter, the overthink, the scrolling on your phone, and just breathe, which is what I need to do now, is just breathe and just come back into my body, just come back into the room, into your surroundings. Take a minute, just breathe, just be present. Switch your phone off for a few minutes, just be present, just see what you notice, see what you feel, because the more we're in our heads and the more we're on our phones, the more cut off we are from our hearts and our feelings as well. So that's going to do it for me for today. I hope this finds you well. As I say, if you made it to the end, I think you need a medal just for that. But yeah, if you have, thanks for watching and take care. Good night. God bless. Bye.